Why is a group of extreme risk takers dominating our society? And how is their mentality influencing everything from tech startups to artificial intelligence? We'll find out in a conversation with election prognosticator and best-selling author Nate Silver, all coming up right after this. Welcome to Big Technology Podcast, a show for cool-headed, nuanced conversation of the tech world and beyond. Boy, do we have a show for you today, one I've been looking forward to for a long time, because Nate Silver is here. He's the best-selling author of The Signal and the Noise. He's also the author of a new book called On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. It's out this week. It's one of the best books I've read in a long time, and I'm really stoked for this conversation. So Nate, welcome. So great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it.
You know, your book goes into this group of risk takers. You call them the river. We'll get into that in a minute. But I'm just curious how you think about risk taking, because risk is something that's all around us all the time. Some people have frameworks for it. Some people don't. A lot of people are risk averse. A lot of people sort of approach risk as it comes. But you've thought a lot about risk. So tell us a little bit about the way that you think about risk. And is it good to take a lot of risk?
So that's a lot of good questions. I think in general, most people are too risk averse. Although in the book, you meet lots of exceptions. In the book, you meet some of the people who are overly into risk, who are degenerate gamblers, we sometimes call them. That can be sometimes a term of affection, sometimes not. But in general, look, we have millions of years of human evolution and societal and civilizational evolution, which is premised on like barely eking out a living in a subsistence lifestyle where you might have a life expectancy of 40 years. If you catch a disease, there's a good chance that you'll die from it. And so most people are safety oriented and sometimes don't take enough opportunities where they can better their life or change their life or take what I would call a plus EV, meaning positive expected value gamble. And there are studies that show, for example, that when Steve Levitt, the famous Freakonomics economist, has done studies where when people flip a coin to make decisions and it comes up heads and they make a change, so meaning like changing careers, moving locations, getting out of a relationship that you feel ambivalent about, on average, they wind up happier. So that's kind of like the short version, but people should also be better about how they measure risk. People have a lot of sloppy heuristics when it comes to assessing potential courses of action. You know, I come from the world where my kind of lodestar is poker. I took kind of a low risk consulting job out of college and quit that after a couple of years to go play poker professionally during the so-called poker boom years of the mid 2000s. Now in poker, you can calculate things quite precisely, right? There are 52 possible cards. You can run the permutations and combinations for the order in which they might come out. Real life is not that easy sometimes. But yeah, what the book is trying to do is give you like a guide to the mentality of people that are in this world. And it's mostly about people who are taking mathematical, quantitative types of risks. So, you know, poker players or venture capitalists or hedge funders. But there are also people who take physical risks. There's like an astronaut I talked to in the book and like an explorer, an NFL player. And oddly enough, actually, they have some of the same types of mentality. Being cool under pressure is obviously a huge thing. Not being results oriented is a term we use a lot in poker, where you have imperfect information. You have to make the best choice you can given the information you have. And sometimes you have to make a choice quickly, because in business and other things, if you wait to have perfect information, well, somebody else is already taking advantage of that opportunity. And so being kind of very focused on process and being focused on the long run and having a long time horizon, these are all helpful qualities.
Right. And we're already in it here. I mean, we're talking about expected value. Now, one of the things that perked up for me when I was reading the book was you bring up expected value, you talk about it a lot. And I'm, thought about, this is an effective altruist term. We've talked about EAs on the podcast in the past, and we're going to definitely talk about how effective altruists think about risk, and especially the way that approach to risk has been reflected in the business community and the tech community in particular. But can you just define what expected value is? Because clearly this is something that extends beyond EA and is also, like, I think, pretty foundational when you're thinking about the type of risks you want to take.
So expected value is what outcome you get on average in situations where there's randomness or uncertainty. So if you invest in a portfolio, you start a fund to invest in whatever 20 early stage startups. Then the expected value might be that you expect a third of them to never make a dollar, right? A third of them to break even, and then a third of them to make money. And the question is, what's the chance of like a 100x or 1,000x outcome in that bunch of startups that you invest in? Poker, it's even more clear since is literally an element of randomness in poker. But that's all it is. It's a situation where it's important to make a distinction, by the way. It's a situation where you are playing out a scenario some number of times. Or at least some theoretical multiverse version of you, right? If there are 52 cards in a poker deck, then every card will be dealt once the next time. And figuring out kind of what the average result is on average in those situations. Now, look, if it's a one-off decision, should you risk your life or something when the risk of death is tangible? Maybe not the best framework. But for repeated decisions, even things like, let's say you're going to work and there's one route that's faster on average, but there's a drawbridge that's unpredictable. And if you hit the drawbridge, then it'll be slower. That's a situation where you might think about like, okay, if I get in 5 minutes late, does it matter? Or will my boss like fire me? That kind of thing. But like, I think it's actually in some ways a fairly intuitive concept when we have repeated practice with uncertain situations.
Right. And I think another way I just thought about it is, and tell me if this is right, like if you're thinking about asking out like a romantic prospect and you think, if I do this 100 times, they're going to say yes 60 times and no 40 times based off like my interactions with them and all the people I've asked out in the past. That would be a positive expected value thing to make you go and ask them out, because the average, if you take all of it, is a yes.
Yeah, look, and I think it gets into slightly cliched life advice, but I generally think people who are willing to take a risk and ask for things they might want, right? Whether it's a romantic partner or a new job or a friendship or whatever else, I think they're usually rewarded by that. I mean, people are often paralyzed by uncertainty where they do nothing, and that can often be the riskiest course of action. If you're taking physical risks, certainly, if you're in some type of military battle, just standing there and doing nothing when you're getting shelled is the worst course of action. Maybe you want to retreat, maybe you want to attack and fight back and try to disrupt the source of the whatever incoming missiles. But the kind of, the fight, flight, or freeze reaction, I mean, sometimes people freeze when that's the worst possible choice.
So you divide society into basically two different groups, right? This is like a good foundation for it. The first is the river, people that think about life in these terms and are willing to take risks. And then the village, which is, I guess, like people who want that safety. Talk a little bit more about the river and the village, and why was it necessary to make that distinction?
I mean, a couple of reasons. One is that I'm a very like geographic kind of visual figure, so imagining things as like kind of a mental map. The river is kind of a term borrowed from poker. So on poker, the last card that's dealt in Texas Hold'em is called the river, but also poker kind of comes from the Mississippi River boats, right? That's its origin, where you have different people with lots of time on their hands who like to take risk, and that's where poker emerges from. But what I found in writing the book is that like these different communities that we've already touched on, so like poker or VC or crypto, or to some extent even effective altruism, although they're a little bit different because they're altruistic, at least in principle. You meet the same types of people, which are people who are very analytical, so good with numbers, good with probabilities, crossed with being very competitive, right? Sometimes in a way to make money, but also just wanting to, I mean, Elon Musk is insanely competitive, right? You're getting people who are at the extreme right tail of how much they care about proving themselves to themselves or proving themselves to others. That combination is very powerful. The counterpart to that is what I call the village, and that's like a little bit more of a familiar term. I mean, I think of the village as kind of academia, government, especially when you have a democratic or progressive government, academia, journalism, nonprofit sector, fields like that where it's less individualistic, it's more risk averse. You're maybe more concerned about your social status, right? In the village, the ultimate punishment, although this might be changing a little bit, is ostracization, or cancellation might be the more modern term. for it. If you look at how political parties behave, there's a lot of groupthink. When Joe Biden dropped out, and full context for the reader, that's happened very recently before we're recording this. When Joe Biden dropped out, all of a sudden, every single Democrat goes ahead and endorses Kamala Harris. They're all kind of playing follow the leader, which is kind of very different than the poker player mentality when you're trying to be maybe more of a lone wolf, or in Silicon Valley where they're explicitly trying to be contrarian and look for bets that other people or companies and ideas that have been overlooked by the rest of society.
Okay. And so your thesis is that the river is winning? Why is that?
I mean, if you look at the profits for venture capital, I mean, the top decile firms are making rates of return of 20% per year. That's really high. I mean, if you look at finance continues to grow, meaning Wall Street as a proportion of the economy. Las Vegas continues to grow every year. I mean, part of it is that, look, it doesn't necessarily mean that like the average VC fund is doing that well. Like the non-elite firms, their returns aren't particularly extraordinary. But if you're looking at what kind of happens, I mean, how do you end up with people who wind up with that are worth $200 billion? They almost by definition have to be both really lucky and really good, and keep doubling down and making more and more bets. I mean, Elon Musk, for example, chose a very incentive compensation heavy deal with Tesla, the other companies that he's been in. Even something like investing in Twitter or buying Twitter when he kind of has his life made. And, I think buying out X, I suppose, that's kind of a high risk thing in a way. Not quite the same as high risk if you're like struggling to make an income and you like cross some international boundaries, refugee, like that's also an admirable, maybe more real risk in certain ways. But the people who keep doubling down and are skilled enough to win not every bet, but more bets than not, are the people that by definition in a world of 8 billion people kind of wind up on top. And the very richest people, the top 10 richest people in the world, are worth about twice as much as they were 10 years ago. You keep seeing this tail get pushed outward and outward. And by the way, those people are, by most definitions, to some degree or another, all self-made. If you inherit a huge fortune, you don't have that much incentive to keep gambling with it. But if you're kind of selected for being a maverick, rebellious founder, and a lot of people who are in that department had some type of trauma or challenge in their childhood where they kind of keep having to feel over and over to people like they have to prove themselves, and they feel like they have some duty to themselves or others to continue to compete and gamble, then that's where you get the extreme part of the distribution curve.
Right, and we're going to go through some of these things, including poker, VC, effective altruism, AI. But I first want to ask you a couple questions before we move on. First of all, okay, so you're saying basically capitalism rewards risk. Is this such a new idea? I mean, this seems to be something that's fairly self-evident.
I think it is self-evident. I think, though, also, it can take a long time for industries to mature and play out. Like poker is a good example where if you took like now you have what are called computer solvers in poker. So a solver is literally, technically speaking, the Nash equilibrium. It's a game theory optimal solution to poker. Now, it's very complicated, the solution. It involves a lot of randomization and mixing different strategies, even with the same hand. But I think people don't realize what happens when you have exponential growth, right? You have exponential growth and the world grows at 2% per year globally or 3% per year. That begins to add up. But also when you have sectors like tech that grow at 10% per year, that really begins to add up. So it's like not a new idea, but the kind of manifestations of it. And also the fact that you're now getting into technologies like AI. And if you read the book, I have complicated feelings against AI. I kind of present arguments for and against P-doom, so-called, the chance of catastrophic outcomes from AI, as well as the chance of very good outcomes. But this is kind of the trajectory of capitalism, is that people keep making more and more bets. And also in some ways, government capacity in the U.S. is getting, I believe, somewhat weaker. There is still a very large governmental sector. I mean, there are a lot of taxes. The federal government's very active in state governments. But look at AI. It's not like the Manhattan Project, which was developed by the U.S. government. It's being developed by the private sector. Medical innovations happening more and more in the private sector, for example. And look at things like social media, even. I mean, someone like the owner of Twitter or a big technology platform might have more power to affect how the world works than even many governments around the world do. So I think it's not new. It's just we're kind of like seeing the manifestations of it. And despite a lot of missteps from Silicon Valley and big tech, I mean, you can point to lots of failures of judgment and lots of personality types that are flawed. The fact is that they do keep growing and keep winning and become like a larger and larger segment of the American economy.
Right. It's almost like there's so much more action happening in the river, quote unquote, now that there's a potential to even win even more. But we'll discuss this throughout. I have one more question for you before we keep going, which is that, I mean, you pointed to the Democrats as like a fall in line type of group, but I mean, I'm not even saying this from like a partisan standpoint. The Republicans certainly are a fall in line group. If you see what they've done with Trump, for instance, like they are definitely a group that doesn't really tolerate like, sort of the lone wolf type of thing and standing out, and speaking out against the consensus.
For sure. I mean, and this is kind of why I've always felt like I never really fit in politics in general. I mean, a lot of people in the river are people who are dissatisfied with the two-party system. So they might over-index toward third parties, for example, or over-index toward more centrist or libertarian candidates, for instance. But yeah, politics in general is about in-group coalition building and reinforcement, right? You don't want people to think for themselves particularly much. There's a lot of social signaling. You have to form consensus around a nominee. And so, yeah, part of the inspiration for the book was me feeling alienated as part of a world where I was mostly known for covering politics and kind of feeling like I was bashing my head up against a wall where, I think political partisans are happy with you if you say their candidate is winning and unhappy if you say they're losing in your forecast. And there's not a whole lot of nuance and complexity beyond that. But there is this group of people that are more numerous than you'd think, that do think in terms of probabilities and expected value. It's a common personality type on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, which again are like, you can have mixed feelings about them, but they are industries that are kind of in some ways eating the world more and more. And I think that again, that combination of like the analytical part mixed with the competitiveness and the desire to prove people wrong, it's just some type of like skeleton key for unlocking high variance. I mean, by variance, I mean, you can also have like very bad outcomes. Yeah, we talk a lot about SBF in the book, who not only ruined himself, but also did a lot of damage to other people. And there are people who believe that AI has some very serious tail risks as well.
So we're talking about this idea of the river, people that are interested in taking chance, a little bit more risk forward, and how they're winning. And it does also seem like maybe society is moving in a way that indicates that it's feeling these shifts and responding to them. And I think, we're going to go through all this effective altruism, AI, VC, but we're going to briefly touch on this sort of, I think you talked about like a poker moment, or this basically the growth of poker in the US and worldwide. Whereas a few years ago, the World Series of Poker was like held, not televised, not really paid a lot of attention to. And now it's become this thing that's like on ESPN. You've been in the World Series of Poker. You've done quite well in the event, but it's become almost like maybe. Tell me if I'm wrong here. I think it's the most watched like non-sport sport. Like no one's like running around and stuff, but like it is very captivating on ESPN, and people really pay attention to. Poker players have become celebrities, and so what's behind the rise of poker? Is it just a reaction to the fact that people see that this type of river style thinking is going to be a winning ticket for them?
I think that's part of it, is that, if you're in fields like finance or tech, I mean, all the guys I know who work for hedge funds, or the women who work for hedge funds, like poker is like your training mechanism to practice decision making under uncertainty. And I think it's actually fairly similar in a lot of ways. It partly grew. So by the way, we just had the main event of the World Series of Poker back in July, and it set another record with over over 10,000 participants paying $10,000 each. So you have $100 million prize pool, basically. I think, ironically, the pandemic helped to boost poker. So part of what happened is that people were trapped, I guess, in isolation or indoors, began playing a lot of online poker games. And when the real world opened back up again, there were record numbers of players who felt stir crazy and were playing in poker tournaments. Like, I think we talk a lot in the book about the gender issues in poker. My podcast partner, Maria Konnikova, is a great female poker player. There are some great players that we talk to in the book. I do think also you're in a world, however, where a lot of men feel a little bit lost, and like poker provides an opportunity for a bonding experience, that you can go and play poker and have some degree of hang out with the guys and the girls and have some degree of socialization and competition. I mean, it is a game that combines a lot of things that I think are very interesting. There's math, but there's also a lot of people reading. There's risk. There's reward. It feels really, really, really good to like make a deep run in a poker tournament where everyone else has been eliminated and you're kind of one of the survivors and your chip stack grows over and over again. I mean, poker is also a classically very American game. It did kind of originate in the American, Mississippi River Delta, although now you have people from all around the world who play the game too. But there's something about like part of it, I think, too, Alex, is like, I think we're getting more bifurcated in our risk preferences, meaning that there are some people now who are, you saw during COVID that some people are very risk averse, and that might be sensible if you're in a high risk situation or setting. And some people are more YOLO. And so instead of having this nice bell curve, because you want both, right? You want people who are cautious in society, and you want people who push the envelope, and probably society benefits when you have a mix of those in the aggregate.
You have such a great line in the book. You say people are becoming more bifurcated in their risk tolerance. You've got the Netflix guy in the country and the strip club guy in Miami. I mean,
yeah, you got people, and it feels like we have more and more options, but options can be like paralyzing and crippling to some people. I mean, I think people have felt there's less and less trust in almost every institution in the U.S. Less trust in media, less trust in government. In COVID, people often felt like they got contradictory advice and had to make up their mind for themselves. And that can be both wonderful and terrifying. If you feel like I kind of rule my own roost, then that can be great for some people who are comfortable with uncertainty and optionality and things like that. In a more virtual world too, you can like have more influence with more people around the world. But if you're someone who's like paralyzed by choice and just wants safety, or not paralyzed, but just in a life situation where you have things to take care of, you have kids to take care of, or health problems to take care of, that can be more challenging. And I kind of worry that we're having a certain new type of inequality almost, where people who understand risk and understand new technologies like AI and understand how to be entrepreneurial and how to kind of craft their own way in life have like never done better. But then it's harder for the average person, I think, to cope with this. And sometimes, I don't mean this in a conspiratorial way, but sometimes things are kind of like rigged against them, right? If you go into a casino and play slot machines, literally the big casino companies, Caesars and MGM, literally hire teams of analytics nerds to figure out how to manipulate those slot machine probabilities to make you gamble more and more and more.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like all marching down to zero. It's just a question of how you get there. Although I will say the best way to play slots is you go play penny slots. I know they have worse ads, but you put $5 on a card, play those penny slots, and get like 3 drinks, and your night is made as you play.
Look, and there can be good. Look, the word I use a lot in the book is agency. If you're a person who has high agency and you say, you know what, I'm spending an amount of money that I can afford. I'm going to go play slots or blackjack, and I have $200 in my wallet, and I'm not going to go back to my room and get any more cards or chips, and like I'll get free drinks out of it, and now and then I'll win and have a good story. Then like I think that's totally fine, right? I mean, I'm kind of at least a lowercase L libertarian, so I'm not in favor of like banning any of this. But people who are prone toward different types of addiction or manipulation, then I worry about more and more. I mean, most people are not problem gamblers, but like problem gamblers gamble so much they make up a lot of, probably not the majority, but a decent share of casino revenues.
And this is where we sort of put your river versus the village thesis to the test and ask if the river is really winning, because you have this stat in your book saying that Americans alone lost $60 billion in gambling in 2022, and then an extra $40 billion in unlicensed gambling and $30 billion in state lotteries. So, I mean, is it that the river's winning, or like a select portion of the river that actually understands what it's doing is winning?
A select portion of the river, because like another game, for example, that in a certain way is kind of rigged against you, and you have to be careful. Let me be careful about how I say this, but sports betting, the problem with sports betting is that if the sports betting site thinks you're good, then they'll probably limit you from betting more than a few dollars a game. It varies from site to site. DraftKings, for example, is more eager to limit people than Caesars, at least in my experience. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's, the river isn't necessarily the average person in a casino in Las Vegas or New Orleans or whatever. And by the way, I should say both of these communities are communities of elites, relatively small numbers of people, and the average American is trying to navigate between these. And that's, by the way, why they have all these rivalries. When you saw, it's a little bit, if you're not a politics fan, this is a little bit esoteric, but when you saw like Bill Ackman and hedge fund people going after like the presidents of Harvard and MIT and whatnot, that was a classic river versus village confrontation.
Our listeners are familiar, for sure.
Okay, I'm sure. Yeah.
So,
but Harvard is a classic village institution, and hedge funds, VC, are classic river institutions. So, and that was a fight.
Although you could argue Harvard's a hedge fund itself, right? It has so much money in the
market.
Well,
I mean, that's the deep irony of of all of this, right? Is I think, and you can point out lots of hypocrisies on both sides. That Harvard does like print money with a huge endowment. On the other hand, lots of people in the river think of themselves as being nonpartisan and above politics, but you see that partisanship is a very powerful drug, and I'm probably not in a mood to point toward individuals and say, oh, that person's a partisan and that person's not, but like they often get like quite pilled, quote unquote, by politics, and it's, are not always able to remain neutral. They tend to wind up deep team blue or deep team red before too long. Politics can be intoxicating in that way. So yeah, both these groups are full of personality flaws, and although I'm kind of more in the river mindset, I have experience in both, and part of what the book's trying to do, like, my pitch to people in the village is like, I can help you to understand how these people in the river think, because I'm one of them, and I talk to them, and I think I have very honest conversations with them. But they can be trying to take advantage of you, or can be trying to run circles around you, and they are very capable of lots and lots of lapses and errors in judgment, as well as just things that are kind of self-serving in the way that different technologies are regulated, for example.
Right. And we will get into that in a moment. Also, for listeners, towards the end of this conversation, we're going to ask Nate for his 3 key poker tips. I'm excited for that. I recently joined a once a month weekend poker game, so this will help me, but we're going to hold off on that for a moment because we do want to talk a little bit about sports betting and then get into the VC stuff. The sports betting section of your book is fascinating. The first part that I found so interesting was, or I would just say the most interesting part to me, was the fact that the casinos don't really have such a sophisticated operation setting lines, and they're waiting for professional bettors who've their own formulas or crunching numbers to make their bets, and then they sort of adjust the line based off of what these pro bettors are. So effectively, if you get in to a bet pretty early on, or immediately once it goes up, you might have better odds than if you wait.
For sure. No, look, you might have some smart kid who's 25 years old who whatever, PhD in economics or math, or not even a PhD probably, maybe, but more likely just a BA in math, and is getting paid $100,000 a year to go work for a casino somewhere, and the college basketball lines must go up, and he uses a computer program to estimate Duke versus North Carolina or whatever else, and maybe he's talking to his colleague on the other side of the desk, but no, I mean, they are not that sophisticated in terms of setting lines. What they're good at is understanding how to account for information and the actual act of what is called bookmaking, right? Maybe, Alex, they think that you're smart, so the line starts out with the Kansas City Chiefs favored by 2 points. When you bet on the Chiefs, they'll move the line to Chiefs -3. Whereas for me, they think I have the profile of a recreational bettor. I bet on the Chiefs every week. So when I make that bet, they're not going to change one thing. They'll want to keep the line there to encourage me to bet more, potentially. So that act of gaining information is a traditional process of bookmaking, and it's a market discovery, almost like an auction type format, a price discovery format.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
In your book, you talk a lot about sports betting, but the one thing that you sort of stay away from, or maybe it's not applicable, but I want to get your opinion on, is the fact that this is potentially dangerous for the sports. I mean, I think probably the Shohei Ohtani thing happened after your deadline, but we've already had, Shohei potentially implicated in a sports betting scandal, or definitely implicated. We don't know if he was involved, but, who knows? We may never find out. We've had an NBA player suspended. I'm sure there's been, a lot of these platforms won't let college games be bet on. Do you think that sports are getting a little bit too close to the gambling platforms? Because, we're going to just end up seeing scandal after scandal of people being unable to resist. Like, gambling can be in a compulsion, and especially if you have a way of trying to swing the outcome, it can really change the balance of what might be one of the last pure things in the United States or in the world, which is like sports played by the rules.
I think the leagues are getting a little bit greedy in some ways. So, for example, in the NBA, Jonte Porter's a player who was suspended for betting on his own prop bets, right? He would bet that he wouldn't get as many rebounds as the over-under line had, and mysteriously would find ways to miss rebounds and have injuries that required him to be taken out of the game. So why is anyone betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on this obscure player? Like, that doesn't make sense. So having, like, I call it the kind of in and out menu, where you only have like 6 items, but they're all done pretty well. Like, that's more rational, where if people want to bet on, big time sports, the point spread, the money line, which is just the odds that each team will win, or the over-under line, like, that's probably fine. When you have things like player prop bets, when you have things that are based on news, there are many casinos that will let you bet on, like, who is taken first in the NFL draft. If you work for ESPN and you're an NFL reporter, or you work for an NFL team, you're going to have a lot of inside information about that. So I think it's been a little bit of a money grab in the short term, and there's not enough focus on making it more sustainable. Look, I live right in New York City. I go to Madison Square Garden a lot. At one point, there were like literally 3 different ads for 3 different sports books at New York Rangers games on, like, the rink around the ice, the sideboards. Usually people care about category exclusivity in such a narrow venue, but they so didn't care that they were. I mean, I think it was overbought, and you've seen some consolidation where actually DraftKings and FanDuel are doing reasonably well. They have a bit more market share relative to the others, but it's always been a tough business, and the reason it's a tough business is because, like, it's not that hard. I mean, it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's very hard to beat the sports books. But when they offer this gigantic menu of hundreds of different bets on every single game in thousands of leagues around the world, and by the way, and there are 9 legal sports books in New York and however many gray market offshore ones, so I can look for the best line out of thousands of options, it's not that hard to find a line that I can beat by 4% on average, which is what you need to beat the house. You have to beat it by, they take about a 4%, 4.5% cut of every bet. So I think it's always been, in Vegas, sports betting has always been seen as an amenity, AMENITY, meaning, like, you come in, there are certain types of customers that want to go in for the NCAA tournament or for an NFL weekend or, big soccer match and bet a few $100 and gamble and watch on the big screen. And sports books are fun, kinetic environments. If you go to, like, I was there for Copa America. I was just in Las Vegas, and, like, it's fun to see kind of the Colombian fans and the Argentinian fans and all the people who have action on the game. Like, that's a fun piece of, like, eye candy for the casino. But sports betting's never been a major profit center. It's like 1 or 2% of overall Vegas revenues, and I think it's been like a little overbought in a way that isn't fully sustainable.
Right. Okay. One last thing on sports betting. I don't know if you guys started this at 538 when you were there, but this was something that's always kind of annoyed me about the analytical approach to sports. Is that like sometimes the sites will be like, this team has a 70% chance of winning, or this player has like a 30% chance of hitting a home run. Like you watch Apple baseball on Apple TV right now, and it's ridiculous. Like they adjust the win probability with every percentage. And for me, as like a massive sports fan, I've always thought this is the word chance is so wrong here, because it's not a chance. Like it's not like you're like putting a ball in the roulette wheel and allowing it to come where it is. It's actually something that's determined by human outcome, human intervention here. And I just think chance is the wrong word for this. What's your response to that?
We can get into some existential questions here. I think it like literally depends on the sport to some degree. In a sport like hockey, for example, which there's a lot of luck in hockey, generally speaking, teams don't have that large an edge. Like literally, if the Zamboni made a certain patch of the ice slick in between periods, and maybe the puck bounces and goes in the goal, and like otherwise it doesn't, certainly. But that's actually a very deep, Alex, existential debate about the kind of nature of uncertainty. Look, epistemologically, you don't know, right? It might be true that it's not literally a matter of chance, although some things actually are kind of random. Like this is part of what like chaos theory said, is that some systems are irreducibly complex, like weather systems, for example. Now, I don't know if like a baseball game fall in that category, but there is probably some element of literal chaos, I suppose.
Okay. I feel like we could do a full show on this, but I'll accept the argument.
For sure.
All right. One more thing about on this line, politics. So Polymarket, watching it predict like who's going to be the nominee, who's going to win the election. You can bet on anything there. It's a betting site on sort of news outcomes. I think you're on the board as well. Is this?
I'm an advisor to Polymarket. That's
an
correct.
advisor.
Yeah.
Are these prediction markets getting to be better than actual polling in terms of predicting an outcome?
So I have my own polling-based model at my newsletter, so I'm a little bit partial to it. However, one thing about polling is that it takes a few days to incorporate new information. You actually have to contact people on the phone or online and have them take your poll, and you go back and do your weights and run your numbers. Whereas they get to react to things in real time. So, for example, in the disastrous debate for Joe Biden, was it June 26th or 27th or something like that? You could see reflected in real time prices at Polymarket and other markets changing on the chance that not just Trump would win, but that Biden would drop out. You could see Bitcoin reacting in real time because Trump is seen as bullish for Bitcoin. So, these were not people who were waiting for information to come in. They were people who were making their best guesses in real time. And that skill's underrated too. Look, I'm a guy who loves to be rigorous. The book is very rigorous. It involved 3 years of reporting and writing. The model we build is thousands of lines of code. But the skill that people on the river have to make decisions based on incomplete information is often vital. Because if you wait for complete information, then someone else has already made that bet first, right? There's no more profit in that bet anymore. You have to be willing to make judgments when the data is noisy. And that's kind of what makes the actual skin in the game, risk-taking communities actually have the potential to make profit, and makes like academia or the village then too slow most of the time.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're a river guy, but you're also a polling guy. And the answer that I'm hearing you give right now is maybe the river will eventually have an edge on polling in politics, or am I reading this wrong?
I think this is changing too, in part because, the markets are becoming more like, the politics markets are becoming more like sports betting markets, which again are at least pretty smart once you have price discovery. I think the reason why is that everything is kind of becoming eaten by politics now. And so you have more and more financial firms, hedge funds, investment banks, so forth, who think they have to like understand political risk, because political risk can affect things like different classes of stocks, how different industries are regulated, interest rates, whether foreign countries, if you're investing in some foreign exchange, is this country going to be stable or not? Will the leadership be good for the economy, good for equities? So you have more and more investment, I think, and this is somewhat firsthand knowledge based on going around and talking to people about consulting opportunities and so forth. I have noticed more sophisticated conversations happening in the last few years. Some of these companies will trade in different ways, but like prediction markets are a part of that. I mean, the critique was always that when you just had kind of hobbyists, that it didn't get that far because you only have like one election every 4 years. Building an election model is hard. People are very partisan, but you have kind of more institutional investment now in building models of things involving political risk or other types of exotic derivatives where there's actually adequate liquidity and actually adequate opportunities to trade, which I didn't think was as true, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
That's crazy, Nate, because, I mean, we know that money has influence on politics. Are we going to end up getting to a place where, like, I mean, I guess this was always the case, but, like, companies or financial institutions that may end up placing big bets on candidates in one arena just work hard behind the scenes to manifest that outcome that they're financially linked to?
I mean, there are a couple of things here. One is that there have been accusations before. In 2012, for example, there were accusations that Mitt Romney traders were deliberately buying up Romney stock at prediction markets because they thought that would create favorable buzz, and therefore that's like free earned media, for example. But remember, that's at a point 12 years ago where there's less volume, so you have to spend less to influence or manipulate, if you want to use the term, that market. Yeah, look, you do get into some gray areas here where if you have like, traditionally organizations like the CFTC, which regulates commodities exchanges, have not loved betting on real world events, in part because they were worried that it could create moral hazard, for example. If you're betting on some insider trading case or something like that, then if you have access to like manipulate the markets. However, the fact is that like, if I were talking to CFTC, this risk is priced into lots of commodities and so forth anyway, that when the Donald Trump price increases, it's probably good for maybe defense contractors or Bitcoin or whatever else. I don't want to speculate too much. That's not the part of it that I do.
Right.
But political risk has huge effects around the world. If there's some, dictatorship that emerges in what had previously been a capitalist country, then that can have profound effects on the global economy. Things like for example, if you're investing in NVIDIA or semiconductor supply chains, and understanding the China-Taiwan conflict is going to be like very important potentially. And so these things are things that people have to price anyway. And the argument for prediction markets is that they give you a more efficient and explicit way to do it.
Right. Okay, let's talk about VC and founders. We're like 40 something minutes in. We have to do this. It's the show mandate.
Cool.
But VCs and founders, they think about risk in really different ways, which is another thing that you highlight in the book that to me was surprising. So can you talk about like the different type of risk that a VC and a founder tries to take on, and how does that influence what they do?
Yeah, I mean, the main difference is that most VCs want founders who are going all in on an idea with a very long time horizon. So for 10 years or often more. I mean, these companies can have, the J curve means you can often take 10, 12, 15 years before your fund is actually making money, even if you've made good investments.
Right. I love how you call these founders hedgehogs.
Hedgehogs.
Basically,
this comes
get in that hole and keep burrowing.
Yeah. So this comes from the typology from Isaiah Berlin, where a hedgehog versus a fox, where a fox is crafty and kind of roots around for different things and it's kind of like a hunter-gatherer type, right? Whereas a hedgehog very much like digs in and stays buried in the hole and is very much all in. So for a founder, being a founder is, I think, legitimately often a very risky thing to do. It's pretty rare for a company to become the next Google or SpaceX or whatever else. By definition, you're pursuing an idea that probably is not adequately addressed in the market. Usually the market's smart. It's for a good reason that your idea wouldn't work potentially. And so you have all these VCs who are foxes, right? They'll say, yeah, actually, we don't want to have too much domain knowledge. You talk to like Michael Moritz, right? He used to be a journalist and then became one of the best investors on Earth.
Right, from Sequoia.
Yeah, Sequoia. He's like, yeah, as a journalist, you kind of parachute into a place and you have to, again, use incomplete information to make decisions quickly. And you don't necessarily want to be a domain expert. Sometimes domain experts get blinded or biased by the forest for the trees a little bit. You want to be like a good generalist. Whereas for a founder, you want them to solve a problem in a different way and devote all their resources to it and be a true believer in themselves, right? Paul Graham, another VC I talked to, says you need founders to be optimistic. It's kind of irrational in some ways. You would think you want a founder who's a perfect assessor of risk and very well calibrated. But if you're not like a true believer in your idea, then it's very hard to sell other people on it. And kind of in a world where things are getting more and more quantified and analytically driven, maybe there's more of an edge now from being a true believer and saying, I don't care what the barriers are. I don't care what the conventional wisdom is. I'm just going to kind of plow through things. Now, to be clear, this often ends in disappointment or ruin. And if you're a VC, then you can collect 15 hedgehogs into a fund, and then that turns out to be a very nice thing. I mean, somewhat contrary to the conventional wisdom. Before I started this, before I knew anything about VC, I thought, well, actually, it's like a poker tournament where you lose money most of the time. Like, that's not true. If you talk to Mark Andreessen and Andreessen Horowitz or funds like that, or Sequoia, they'll say, actually, we make money from maybe 60% of our investments return something, and then 20% return a lot, and it's actually a pretty nice business if you are in a top tier firm. But that's from aggregating risk, and that's where you realize expected value is. If you can literally kind of run the experiment 100 times, you can be almost guaranteed to make money. We run simulations in the book where it's like, if you really are returning 20% ROI per year on average with a lot of variance, you're almost guaranteed to make money. And there's enough empirical evidence that a certain A16Z fund will have a down cycle and only make 11% per year for 5 years. It's still better than you can normally do in the S&P 500 or things like that. And so it's a really good business to be able to find these dogmatic founders who are taking huge risks and then have a piece of all of them and hedge that risk.
Right. And you talk in the book about how Silicon Valley marries risk-tolerant venture capitalists with risk-ignorant founders. Basically, founders go all in and it's win or lose. I mean, they'll make a salary probably, but basically they could do all this work, destroy themselves physically for nothing. And whereas a VC, that's okay as long as they pick enough. So, sorry. I guess, you can respond to that. Then I'll ask you.
I mean, VC, look, I mean, the VC mindset is such that when you had FTX blow up, I guess it was Sequoia said, yeah, you want high variance bets, and so we would make the same bet.
Right, they do it again. Which is like they lost a lot of their, I would say, sheen. Sequoia did with the FTX bet, but also I think that you made a good point, which is that one of the things that makes Silicon Valley unique, and it goes back to this quality of being willing to be embarrassed, is they're willing to be embarrassed. Whereas, like, it's not necessarily like in the more villagey status, safety type of occupations and fields, like that actually matters a lot. But for Silicon Valley, it's just another day.
Yeah, and look, you see lots of behaviors in Silicon Valley, some of which are maybe asocial or antisocial behaviors, but everything from like tolerance for psychedelic drug use to tolerance, which may not be a good thing for like difficult kind of, asshole founders. And look, I think within itself, like Silicon Valley, it's kind of conformist relative to itself in certain ways, but it really doesn't care about what the village thinks or what the rest of society thinks, or at least it shouldn't. I mean, I think you have obviously certain VCs and founders are more politically sensitive. But you talk to Mark Andreessen, he thinks the rest of the world's becoming more conformist. And that's great for me because it means the returns to being different are higher now. If there's more of a penalty, a social penalty for nonconformity, then I don't care about the social penalty, and I'll make money and invest in cool things and kind of make my own universe out of this.
But isn't that bullshit? Like a little bit from Andreessen? Because as I'm reading the VC chapter, and I think you even put this in, I started having these questions. All right, so VCs, if you're in a position like Andreessen Horowitz, you're probably guaranteed at least a 15% return as you spread your bets. Yeah. Okay, so that's safety. VCs, they're herd followers, right? So they are pack animals in a way that you would typically associate with the village. And then you ask all right, well, are VCs disruptors or are they incumbents? And in some way, they are the incumbents making money off of the disruptors. So I'm curious what you think about that. Andreessen can talk a big game about time to build and change the world, but with this whole raise your hand up and fight type of mentality, aren't they the man just as much as Wall Street institutions are or the traditional village institutions are?
For sure. Or the comparison I'm sure they won't like that I make in the book is that it's a lot like Harvard or Stanford, because a lot of these guys have become anti-big universities. But if you're Harvard and you're guaranteed to be able to recruit, an 85% yield rate from the best students around the world, it's really hard to fuck that up, right? If you're a startup, then it's such a positive signal to have, Andreessen Horowitz invest in you that you'd kind of have to be crazy to turn them down. And so, Andreessen even told me that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point. I respect the fact that Silicon Valley understands the importance of making high upside bets and understands the importance of having a long time horizon, being willing to project out 10 or 15 or more years. I do think sometimes that some of them are spoiled winners. I say that slightly affectionately, but they have a lot of things going for them. They control a greater and greater share of the world's wealth. And I understand, as someone who himself often gets annoyed by the village, I understand the impetus to be annoyed by it. But going back to being a little bit more apolitical, I think might be a better look, and maybe in the long run, because there is some risk of regulation. Certainly when it comes to things like AI in particular, then government's going to have an opinion about that. In crypto, government's going to have a lot of say over over how crypto works and what the upside potential of those businesses are and those platforms are. Right. So I think they are a little bit asking for fights. And again, I have this tendency too. I'm competitive. I like to pick fights, but it doesn't always. It's not always leading to decisions that I think were good decisions at the end of the day when you kind of wake up and look back on things later on.
Yeah, and I appreciate VC. They fund a lot of interesting things. We talk about them on the show. They're fun to speak with. But with some of the top end ones, there does feel like there's some of the same sanctimony that you would find on a Princeton campus, and that kind of annoys me.
Yeah, it's the horseshoe theory of
exactly. Right.
You objectively have it really good. If you're a tech billionaire and you get to spend all day meeting interesting people and investing in cool businesses and throwing cool parties anywhere in the world, if you have infinite money, then it's a pretty nice life. And I think I understand where the competitiveness comes from. But we are seeing more signs of a tech backlash, and so far they're still making lots of money. But I do think AI in particular is a sector where there is a pretty big appetite for regulation. It's actually one of the few things that both Democrats and Republicans agree upon is they actually are concerned about AI. Not as concerned as the effective altruists or whatnot, but the notion that hey, it's going to take over your job, it's going to lead to discrimination, it's going to lead to whatever else, you're going to cede your agency to the machines, that is intuitively scary for most people. And I think they have to be careful about sports betting is a much lower stakes industry, but like
Right.
VCs should have a long-term outlook, and that includes the kind of political environment in which they're operating. Because you could have a shift toward more regulation for sure.
Totally. Okay, so we'll take a break now, and we're going to come back. I think we'll try to talk about a handful of the following: Sam Bankman-Fried, effective altruism, AI, existential risk, nuclear stuff, and Nate's tips for poker. So I'm going to try to get to at least 3. We'll be back right after this. And we're back here on Big Technology Podcast with Nate Silver. He is the author of On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. You can see it if you're watching on the video here. I've plowed through it. Really great book. Let's talk a little bit about effective altruism. So, and Sam Bankman-Fried in this. We'll start with SBF, then we'll zoom out a little bit. I guess like effective altruism takes this like expected value type of thing to the extreme, and with like SBF, there's a moment in the book you meet with him as like the whole FTX thing is going down, and he's such a compelling character. It's like the 3rd book I've read that has like a lot of SBF, and I feel like my appetite for reading about him is just like endless. But there's an interesting moment where like basically Sam says if he can flip a coin, I'm gonna get details of this wrong, but flip a coin 3 times, and 2 times the world is twice as good as what it is, and 1 time the world is obliterated, he would do it every time.
Or even less than that, right?
You're right, 1.1.
If you win 51 out of 100 flips and you make the world twice as well off, then he literally would take that coin flip. And I think he's actually not even being tongue-in-cheek about that. I mean, he told Carolyn Ellison that in court testimony that I obtained. He said similar things to like Tyler Cowen, the economist. It's philosophy known as utilitarianism, taken to a quite logical extreme. And I think this speaks to, look, I think effective altruists tend to be, I think SBF is not representative of the whole group, certainly. I think they are very smart. They ask questions that other people don't ask, which I always think there's value in doing.
So explain what they are from your perspective. I mean, sorry, I know this is huge. Try to do it in like a minute, because everybody has so many different definitions of them, but you actually went through the reporting process of like meeting and learning about EA, and then you can go back to like the weakness here.
So effective altruism is a brand, is the way I call it, created by Will MacAskill and Toby Ord, who are professors of philosophy, I think, at Oxford. And it kind of is what it sounds like. So the original idea was, how do you more effectively do altruistic things? For example, give more money to charity, right? If I give money to like the American Red Cross or something, you can calculate that actually X% of it is wasted on administrative costs. And then the way they distribute it is for things that may or may not be good, right? And so, the original idea was that if you give money to things, for example, like mosquito nets in Africa, were found to prevent loss of life and prevent severe disease at a pretty low cost. You can like save a life for $5,000 or something on average. So it began, I mean, I'm deliberately simplifying the story here because the origin story gets a little bit convoluted, but it's kind of like the short version of it. It began as a way to do more effective philanthropy. But then people began to apply it to all sorts of other things like animal welfare, for example. If I decide to eat a chicken or some chicken nuggets, right? What is the utility for the chicken's life versus my pleasure and my nutritional value in like eating those chicken nuggets? So I know some EAs, for example, who won't eat chicken, but will eat beef because you can create a lot more portions out of a giant cow than you can out of a chicken. And cows are also kind of dumb, and therefore they are valued less in some EA systems. So it gets very weird very fast. And then kind of where the interest in things like existential risk and AI come from is that if you think that there's a chance that something could destroy civilization, like unaligned AI or like nuclear weapons or like bioweapons, for example, or climate change, although climate change is not traditionally an area of EA focus, we can talk about that. That has a very high expected value gain or loss based on what you do. It's kind of taking this gambler's expected value maximization mindset and applying it to all sorts of real world problems that it's not traditionally applied to, and I'd say with very mixed success.
Right. And the point is that this is sort of making its way into the business world. And if you think if expected value is sort of like your North Star, and you think about like, do I want to risk the company on this behavior that may have like a 2-in-1 chance of working, but a 1 in 3 chance of doom, or 2 of 3 chance of working, 1 in 3 chance of doom. Most founders would never do that, but like SBF, for instance, seemed to be open to making this type of decision.
Yeah, I mean, literally, he told me that if you're not willing to risk completely ruining your life, that you're a wimp, was a term he used, and not undertaking enough risk. And believe me, that is atypical. But, you talk to like Vitalik Buterin, who founded Ethereum, and he's like, yeah, I thought there was only a 10% chance that it would work out like this, right? But if you make 100x your money in that 10% of the time, then the expected value is positive. I mean, my issue with someone like Sam is more that I think he's miscalculating a lot of things. If you talk to people who were in his orbit, then, he was the person who might make a good first estimate, but then not refine it and become very hedgehog-like and get very dug in, and also not thinking about the harm that would occur to other people. But look, I'd be the first to tell you that, like, I like to work on problems that are kind of closed-ended problems. So we were talking before about sports and how is it really random or whatnot. You can get into some philosophical discussions there about sports or elections, what's really random, what's not. But the fact is that you can represent these things reasonably well with the model. Sometimes there are little fudge factors that you might round up or round down the model based on things that it's a little bit hard to quantify, but your experience tells you are important. But these are kind of closed world problems that you can have repeated trials of. I worry that sometimes the EAs are like operating in a world where they assume everyone has like 200 IQs instead of us regular stupid human beings, and often have like a lot of short-sighted realizations. Because when I look at like work even in sports or something like that, there are lots of bad election models out there and bad sports models, and that's with relatively good data and closed systems. So you can very easily make very bad models if you're not careful.
Exactly, and that to me is like the huge hole in expected value that we've been talking about through this whole conversation. And I think you explicitly like talk about this in the book, that like basically expected value can be good for things that are quantifiable, but the problem is that people will take it and say like, this has an expected value of this, but they're fudging it. They're really, I think you called it improv. And to me, it sounds a lot like a religion. So this is what I maybe this is from the book, or maybe I just wrote this as a note. But there are strict values up until there's something that has self-interest. And then you can squeeze it in and sort of fit your expected value calculation. And this is some examples you gave, that effective altruists, they say that, future lives are important, but they also are okay with abortion, which is an ideological inconsistency. I'm not taking a position on it. They're okay with not having kids, although they value future lives. They defend immigration restrictions because they say that like if we're anti-immigration, then like it means that there's a chance that like more pro-immigration politicians will come in and allow more immigration. Like it reminds me exactly of religion, where like you have this tenets and you have these self-beliefs and you make the tenets work to advance your self-beliefs. It feels like the same exact thing. And I know religion is sort of like a pejorative in these type of worlds, but that's what it sounds like. And that's a huge, huge liability when it comes to expected value.
I mean, there are some similarities, right? Just like in some churches, you tithe, I'm not sure how to say that word, but give 10% to the church. Some EAs believe in earning to give, where you go work for a hedge fund or something, and then you give 10% of your income away for that. Look, one of the ironies in the book is I think people who are operating in the world of like VC or poker, in some ways, the profit motive grounds you a little bit, and kind of gives you maybe more of a BS detector. And that, whereas if you're a true believer, like the people who worked for SBF, I think were actually very nice, conscientious people, but that may have made them less skeptical than they should have been of Sam himself. And don't get me wrong, like I think a lot of EAs have done a lot of smart things with respect to like poverty reduction and things like that. I think overall, having more focus on existential risk is a big win for EAs. I mean, there's been a paradigm shift in the awareness of the conversation about AI and what risks and opportunities that it might pose potentially. So I think they've done good for the world on that. I think it's a small community. It is fairly demographically homogenous, right? It's, a lot of kind of 30-something, mostly white people, a lot of men, very concentrated in some areas like Oxford or Silicon Valley or things like that. Maybe people who don't have that much necessarily life experience. So I think it's a useful movement, but there are things that are, I think religion is a little bit too disparaging of it. But they proselytize, right? They want to spread the word. They tend to be pretty good at PR. When there's an EA book coming out, it has big book release parties and things like that. And I think there are definitely some parallels.
Yeah, look, my first introduction really to AI was learning about it through SBF. But after it's been a year or so since I learned about it, and I'm more impressed with it now than I was previously, but there are still some flaws. So, but it is a very interesting movement, and we'll be doing more about it on the show. Let me ask you this then, and this is sort of what it all sort of builds up to, which is that EA is extremely influential in the AI field. And just not even just EA, just this thinking, this similar thinking, river style thinking in expected value. And then this sort of hypothetical that you had with SBF of flip a coin 100 times, 51 times the world is twice as good, 49 it's destroyed. And a lot of people who think in this expected value mentality will be all right, I'll flip that every time. Maybe not a lot of people, maybe Sam is the outlier. But then you think about AI and it's is AI that exact calculation where AI, if it works out well, will make the world twice as good? And if it works out poorly, it might destroy the world. And do you want people with this type of thinking to be running AI projects?
Yeah, so Sam Altman, who, believe me, I think is not in the same category as SBF.
No,
I talked to different sources.
He also got ousted by EA-aligned folks. So
yeah. But Sam Altman, and I talked to him, I think, in August 2022 for the first time. That was the main interview, which was a good time because it was when he was a little bit less guarded.
ChatGPT.
Yeah. So they kind of knew what was coming with 3.5 and 4, and it wasn't quite public yet. So he was, I think, in an optimistic and unguarded mood. And he's I think that AI could end global poverty. He meant that very literally. It could end global poverty. We'd have so much economic growth and plenty and automation of tasks that used to be burdensome for human beings that you could end poverty, he thought. But he also thinks that it could also destroy the world. I think the chance that he would put is not as high as some people. But he's literally willing to make not the 50-50 bet that Sam made, but maybe a 90-10 bet, maybe a bet where there's a 10% chance of really bad things happening because he's convinced there's a 90% chance of really good things happening. I guess that kind of gets more into expected value terms, but then you get into questions of what right does he have to make that bet for all of humanity? And there are parallels. When the Manhattan Project was experimenting with atomic weapons, there was one experiment they thought had some chance of actually igniting the Earth's atmosphere on fire. It was very unlikely, but they figured it might be a 1 in 1,000 chance of literally incinerating the Earth, right? Who has the right to take that sort of chance? At least the Manhattan Project is kind of, at least nominally, an offshoot of the U.S. federal government, which is an elected company. But yeah, and look, when you have people who are kind of taking risks on behalf of everyone else, then they often wind up being villainized by society. That's an area where, again, the potential for I think political backlash is fairly high, and it's also if you have these GPUs that have lots and lots and lots of compute. One good thing about AI risk is that there are a finite number of entities that we know have enough compute for now to build top tier models, large language models and other models. That might not be true as things get faster and faster in 5 years and 10 years, which could potentially be more dangerous. But I think in one way, it's reason to be optimistic, is that, like, you know, something doesn't quite add up to me where you have these like smart, rich, like nerds in San Francisco and Silicon Valley making bets for all the future of humanity. Like, something doesn't quite add up there. I mean, I would think humanity might have a tendency to want to have something to say about that, maybe.
Right. And the people that are closest to this are the ones that are most concerned, right? It's like
Right.
we met people who are so afraid of, I think, AI risk that they won't save for retirement. You made people whose P dooms were like in the 30%, and they felt they were considered moderates.
Yeah,
in the community. And yours is between 2 and 20%, which is interesting. But it struck me that you took this fear of existential AI risk pretty seriously.
Look, the fact is that the relevant experts in the field are pretty unanimous. This is at least a risk that we want to monitor, right? So like you just said, Alex, like the fact that the people who are closer to it are more worried is worrisome. Also the fact that, like, we don't fully understand the technology. I mean, people call it like a giant bag of numbers. How large language models do what they do is a little bit of a mystery, and considered like a little bit of a miracle. I mean, people now kind of take for granted, because maybe we're at like a little bit of a plateau, kind of post 3.5, 4. We'll see where we are in a year or so. But like, you have this machine that's basically like can almost pass the Turing test, right? You can like ask it a question about anything, and some of the answers are stupid, but some are quite ingenious and brilliant. It can draw pictures. I mean, there's this like thermostatic increase where you just get used to this for now. But like, few experts in the field would have expected anything like this to occur 10 years ago, right? The reason why OpenAI was originally a nonprofit is because it was not clear. It was enough of a long shot bet that like it wasn't clear if it would work. Oh, you just kind of throw a bunch of like compute through this transformer architecture, and maybe it'll keep scaling up and produce a miracle where you have like a machine that has comparable linguistic intelligence to human beings, and all of a sudden it does, or at least it's pretty close. I mean, that's kind of a miracle. And the fact that it's not fully legible what it's doing exactly, I think ought to be frightening.
All right, Nate, before we leave, love to get your 3 tips for poker players. What are the 3 things that anybody who wants to be good at poker needs to know?
I think the most important basic tip for poker is be aggressive. If you're new in an activity, there's a tendency to take the middle ground. So if you play like a backyard game with people who've never played poker before, they tend to call too much when they should be raising or folding. That mechanic of like take more decisive action is a good decision-making framework across any type of risk-taking, I think. Number 2 is being cool under pressure. And partly that involves not trying to be a hero, right? Executing basic strategy, and kind of, because when you are operating in an environment where all of a sudden you're playing a $10,000 pot in the World Series of Poker or something, you're actually operating on different physical and brain chemistry. Like literally, right? You have a stress response that kicks in, an adrenal response, and you're kind of in like a flow state or a zone state, which some people will panic and go on tilt, and you have to be able to avoid that. That's something that can be learned a little bit with experience. And number 3 is being really observant. One of the things I learned just playing a ton of live poker over the past 3 years is that things like physical tells, getting a read on someone, having an intuition for what someone's doing through their just general demeanor, like that's a real thing. I used to think this was like exaggerated kind of BS, but like it's a real thing. I mean, human beings making decisions under stress are not very good at concealing information. So whether it's like a micro expression or something like that, or a betting pattern or a speech pattern or involuntary, looking at someone's like neck muscles, for example, or the way they're hunched over, what they're doing. If they look away, that can be a sign of strength. And so just being attentive, and the importance of attentiveness is a big lesson, I think, for poker players.
And why don't I throw out a fourth one that I learned from your book, which is that you got to bluff.
And you have to bluff. Yeah. Poker is a game. The whole premise of the game is based on bluffing. There are lots of fun card games that don't involve bluffing per se, although they may involve deception. But the only reason in poker, in theory, to ever pay off someone when they have a good hand is because they are capable of bluffing. And even until you get to the very top 100 best poker players in the world, believe it or not, most poker players bluff too little and not too much.
Yeah, I'm always like, I want to hold on to those chips, but I'm learning after reading the book. Don't do that.
No, you have to take risks to win a poker tournament. It's unavoidable, yeah. And so that's part of why it's an attractive metaphor for life, etc.
The book is On the Edge: The Art of Risking Everything by Nate Silver, who's with us here today. It's out this week. I encourage you to go grab it. Definitely one of the more interesting books I've read in a long time. Nate Silver, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you, Alex.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Big Technology Podcast.